Hello there. Good afternoon if you're in New York. Well, really going into the evening now. And sorry I was a little late. Had to make sure to get some other things straightened out before came on, but I'm here. So once again, hello, Paul Greene-Dennis here, aka Deep Green, and welcome back for another round of readings here from me of One Nation under Blackmail, Vol.1. And just in case, just a heads up, what I'm doing is to pick up Chapter 5, Shades of Gray, Part 2, the second part, since it's a very lengthy chapter. And yeah, so with that being said, let's get back up. Let's pick back up where I left off. It's Chapter 5 of Shades of Gray to finish off this chapter. Black bags and inside jobs. In April 1972, Jack Anderson received a dossier from William Haddad with information on plans being concocted by the November Group, President Nixon's personal advertising agency, to burglarize the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate and other schemes, surveillance, dirty tricks, and the like. Anderson, for reasons that still remain vague, appears to have effectively suppressed this information, and he later mischaracterized the information that Haddad had provided to him. Others who were provided information by Haddad took it a little more seriously. A month before Anderson was brought into the fold, Haddad had alerted the DNC's head, Larry O'Brien, who in turn put Haddad in touch with the DNC Director of Communications, Jon Stewart. In late April, Stewart, Haddad, and Haddad's source, a private investigator named A.J. Woolston Smith, met in New York City to discuss the accusations. This was roughly a month prior to the first of the break-ins at the Watergate complex. William Haddad and A.J. Woolston Smith were by no means strangers to intrigue. Haddad was a longtime political insider within the Democratic establishment and had been particularly close to the Kennedy family. He held various bureaucratic positions, married a Roosevelt daughter, and made a name for himself as a muckraker. It was through the latter role that he became close to Woolston Smith, whom he employed from time to time. Woolston Smith had previously worked for Robert Matthews' private detective firm and worked with the CIA on its resettlement programs for Cuban exiles. Matthew himself was no stranger to the CIA's secret wars on Cuba, a background shared by countless individuals interwoven in the Watergate saga. And some investigators have compiled considerable evidence implicating him in the 1968 assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. Woolston Smith likely came upon the information concerning the DNC via convoluted networks that snaked across the often incestuous world of private investigations and security firms. As Jim Hougan details, Woolston Smith's secretary, Tony Shimon, was the daughter of a Runyonesque former Washington police detective named Joseph Shimon. A convicted wiretapper in his own right, Shimon was the partner of one John Lenn in a detective agency named Allied Investigators, Inc. One of the One of the investigators with whom Shimon and Len were allied on a part-time basis was Louis James Russell. Russell supplied tips to Jack Anderson and, in late 1971, was employed by General Security Services. This was the company hired by the DNC to run security at their Watergate offices, and they would have been the ones tasked with handling the information Haddad had provided. Shortly after Haddad notified the DNC of Woolston Smith's information, Russell resigned from General Security Services and went to work for McCord Associates, the security consulting firm owned by former CIA operative James McCord. At the time, McCord was serving as the head of security for the Committee for the Re-election of the President, CRP, the fundraising body for President Nixon's re-election campaign. Russell, too, worked part-time for CRP. Sorry about that, just making some readjustments. McCord was one of the White House plumbers, the team put together to plug, prevent, and investigate information leaks, which were endemic in the highly paranoid world of 1970s Washington, D.C. Operating alongside him was former FBI agent G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt, another CIA veteran. Yet another CIA man in the plumbers was Frank Sturgis, who has served alongside Hunt in the agency's anti-Castro operations. When McCord and Sturgis were arrested in the Watergate DNC offices in July 1972, they were accompanied by a group of CIA-trained Cuban exiles, Virgilio Gonzalez, Bernard Baker, and Eugenio Martinez. There are a few things about McCord's background that are worth mentioning. After a time in the FBI, he joined the CIA, taking a position within the CIA's Office of Security, the in-house body that monitored the internal security of the agency, ran counterintelligence operations, and provided cover or support for some of the CIA's most sensitive operations. Specifically, McCord was assigned to the security research staff within the Office of Security. There, he owned the craft of electronic eavesdropping, surveillance, and audio countermeasure programs to protect sensitive CIA stations and outposts in Europe. These were all the sorts of techniques that were brought to bear in the course of the Watergate burglary. They also raised some important questions. For example, if McCord was adept at these sorts of affairs, why were the burglaries so remarkably sloppy? McCord had also served as deputy to Paul Gaynor, the longtime head of the security research staff and a powerful figure within the CIA as a whole. From his commanding place within the Office of Security, Gaynor played an essential role in some of the CIA's darkest projects, such as Project Artichoke, a special interrogation program with its focus on hypnosis, sensory deprivation, chemical substances, and psychological harassment that was the immediate forerunner of the notorious MKUltra program. The groundwork for Artichoke had been laid by an earlier project, Bluebird, described in CIA files as experiments involving drugs and hypnosis. Jim Hogan writes that Gaynor was reputed to have maintained an extensive array of files on U.S. citizens, with a particular focus on sexual proclivities. Here we go again. Something that has to do with something sexual for blackmail. These files were known around the agency as the FAG files. The hell? Oh, why am I not? Why am I shocked and not shocked that they call it the fag files? Of course, given who was among these ranks. Proceeding onward. These allegations can be found among the statements made in the 1975 official report of the Rockefeller Commission, an entire section of which is dedicated to the file systems maintained by the CIA's Directorate of Operations. One telling passage of the report reads, miscellaneous files maintained by the Office of Security includes lists of individuals with known or suspected foreign intelligence connections. You're right, it was the 70s. But still, yeah, it was the 70s. I'll start that paragraph. Miscellaneous files maintained by the Office of Security includes lists of individuals with known or suspected foreign intelligence connections, files associated with handled defectors, some of whom may now be U.S. citizens, lists of individuals from whom crank calls have been received by the agency, and lists of persons previously charged with security violations. The Office of Security formerly maintained extensive computer lists of approximately 300,000 persons who had been arrested for offenses related to homosexuality, but these lists were destroyed in 1973. Gaynor's proclivity for dirt collecting, particularly of the sexual variety, brought him into contact with Roy Blick, the head of the Washington Metropolitan Police's so-called Moral Squad, until he was forced into retirement in the 1960s. The Moral Squad, which today would be called the Vice Squad, conducted a series of anti-homosexual campaigns under Blick's leadership. Hello, Pinecone. Sending you greetings from New York. According to author Anna Lvovsky, Blick had a penchant for targeting politicians and other people of influence across the Beltway. His crusading zeal to target homosexuals in the area frequently became the butt of jokes for those in the know. E. Bennett Williams, a D.C. attorney who appeared in the periphery of the Watergate affair, liked to perform a short routine for the Dennises of the After Hours Atlas Club. He would imitate Blick standing at the urinal for hours, hoping, praying that a queer, Blick's preferred terminology, would come along and grab his penis, so he could make a morals arrest, of course. Asshole. Like Gaynor, Blick kept rigorous logs on numerous private sentences. These were recorded on index cards that were stacked high in the safe in Blick's office. According to Lvovsky, when he left the department, he threatened to keep the key. During the CIA's own information collection program on homosexuals and other deviants, police forces across the country were marshaled into the effort, freely turning over their files and working hand in glove with the agency. Yet, when it came to Roy Blick, who was stationed in the nation's capital, cooperation with the CIA went beyond just file sharing. Numerous declassified files show Blick working closely with the CIA. For example, he made his own contacts with the British Embassy available to William Harvey as part of the counterintelligence operation against the Kim Philby spy ring. The CIA's largest the CIA's largest domestic espionage operation, which saw the full cooperation of various police departments and other law enforcement agencies with the agency, was called Operation Chaos. It had been initiated during the Johnson years to monitor the growing civil rights and anti-war movements. James Jesus Angleton, the ultra-paranoid CIA counterintelligence chief, was the driving force behind Chaos's inception. Multiple sub-programs were created, each tasked with the different operational imperatives, and adjacent programs were rallied for support. One such program was called Merrimack, which involved CIA infiltration of anti-war peace groups in the Washington, D.C. area in order to gather information on the organizations, their members, sources of funds, and plans. Merrimack provided much of the information it harvested to Chaos. Merrimack was run from the CIA's Office of Security. As Shane O'Sullivan points out, McCord was then working as chief of the office's Physical Security Division, which would have brought him into direct cooperation with Merrimack and Chaos. Interestingly, E. Howard Hunt appears to have been delivering sealed envelopes and packages believed to contain information on the White House plumbers to Richard Aubert, one of the top CIA officials then overseeing Operation Chaos. O'Sullivan draws other parallels between McCord's post-CIA security firm, McCord Associates, and the CIA's proprietary firms that were involved in Merrimack, Chaos, and more general counterintelligence concerns. Chief among was Security Anderson Security, set up in 1962 to provide support for the Office of Security. Even after Merrimack was supposedly terminated in 1968, Anderson Security was, as late as 1971, managing infiltration and espionage of dissident groups in the capital on behalf of the Office of Security. Intriguingly, Hunt seems to have crossed paths with Anderson Security at the same time he was delivering files to Aubert, and he brought them to carry out security sweeps of the CRP offices. All of this is highly suggestive that lurking within the plumbers unit was an apparatus connected to long-running CIA information collection operations and security matters. The background of James McCord in the Office of Security certainly makes this possible, as does Hunt's involvement with Aubert and Anderson Security. McCord and Hunt, however, claim to not have met until their mutual involvement with CRP. There are reasons to doubt this. Hunt, for example, had been active in the CIA's anti-Castro operations. There, he had worked alongside David Atlee Phillips, the eventual chief of the CIA's Western Hemisphere Division, which encompassed the Caribbean and Latin America. In January 1961, McCord was temporarily detailed to Phillips to run a counterintelligence operation against the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, a pro-Castro activist group. The possibility that McCord and Hunt knew each other because of having operated in the same web of overlapping CIA operations in the 1950s raises other questions. Why were the plumbers being stocked with CIA agents, and why was Hunt turning over information to the CIA? Interestingly, these moves were being made at a time when Richard Nixon, rightfully suspicious of the agency, was seeking to blunt its power. Early plans were made to exclude Richard Helms, the director of the CIA, from national security meetings. While the administration ultimately backed away from these efforts, The administration had nonetheless engaged in consistent bureaucratic wrangling that included all sorts of headaches for the CIA. Part of the reason for this, Kissinger later noted, was that Nixon brought to the presidency a belief that the CIA was a refuge of Ivy League intellectuals opposed to him. Regardless of whatever else was going on in this dense fog of palace intrigue, the House of Cards collapsed on June 17th when police officers arrested McCord, Sturgis, Baker, Martinez, and Gonzalez in the Watergate offices of the DNC. Martinez was found with a key, which he reportedly attempted to conceal by swallowing it. The leader of the arresting officers was Carl Schoeffler, a detective in the DC's Police Criminal Intelligence Division. Schoeffler, incidentally, had been nicknamed Little Blick by his fellow officers, presumably for having interests in activities that resembled those of the infamous Captain Roy Blick. It was soon revealed that a previous break-in had taken place, that bugs had been planted in the offices of the DNC, and that McCord had set up a listening post in a rented room in the Howard Johnson Motor Lodge across the street. The morning after the break-in, the deputy chairman of the DNC, Sam Gregg, called the organization's general counsel, a well-known Washington lawyer named Joseph Carlito Jr. Gregg told Joseph Califano Jr., Gregg told Califano about the break-in and mentioned there was photographic equipment in the offices. Califano advised Gregg that the DNC should closely cooperate with the DC police. Califano then hung up the phone and promptly called another of his other top clients. He later said, "I picked up the phone and called Howard Simons, who was the managing editor of the Post, who was on duty that weekend, and told him there had been a break-in at the DNC. We didn't know who it was, but it looked suspicious." That the DNC and the Washington Post, soon to be written into history for its coverage of the Watergate affair, had the same general counsel is a surprising coincidence. But it's Califano's deeper history and the close relations that he had forged in the previous decade that stretch credulity. At the beginning of the 1960s, he worked for the white shoe law firm Dewey Ballantine, the Dewey being Thomas Dewey, before he was tapped to serve as a special counsel to the Department of Defense's general counsel. A year later, Califano was promoted to become special assistant to U.S. Secretary of the Army, Cyrus Vance. It was during this period that Vance had delved into the world of the CIA and the Army's secret wars. While serving as assistant to Vance, Califano was deployed to the numerous coordinating bodies that brought the CIA and Army together for covert operations against Castro's Cuba. Internal CIA memoranda and the more recently declassified Califano papers illustrate that his involvement with Operation Mongoose would have brought him into contact with a wide-ranging cast of characters, including Edward Lansdale and Ted Shackley. Sound familiar. After Mongoose came to a close, Califano was assigned to its successor, the Interdepartmental Coordinating Committee of Cuban Affairs. He worked closely with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, as evidenced by memoranda Califano sent to them outlining special actions. Califano had his own assistant who worked alongside him through the numerous iterations of the anti-Castro coordinating committees, a young Alexander Haig. Haig later summarized the nature of some of their activities for historian Gus Russo. I was a part of it as deputy to Joe Califano and military assistant to General Vance. We were conducting 2 raids a week at the height of that program against mainland Cuba. People were being killed. Sugar mills were being blown up. Bridges were demolished. We were using fast boats and motherships, and the United States Army was supporting and training these forces. This was after the missile crisis, when the Cuban Coordinating Committee was set up in 1963. Cy Vance, the security of the Army, was presiding over the State Department, the CIA, and the National Security Council. I was intimately involved. As late as January 1964, Haig was working with Califano when the lawyer became the Department of Defense's executive agent for Cuban affairs. His mandate in this position was broad and took place during the general winding down of the agency's heavy focus on Cuba. He was involved in the management and resettlement of Cuban refugees and helped find homes and employment for scores of CIA-trained exile fighters. This likely would have brought both Califano and Haig into contact with the future private investigator A.J. Woolston Smith, the same Woolston Smith who had curious foreknowledge of the Watergate break-ins through his connections to Lou Russell. And what of the Washington Post itself, whose intrepid journalists Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein so famously broke the case? Originally, Woodward and Bernstein had worked separately, pursuing leads into the murky world of former CIA agents and shadowy security units like the Plumbers. At the behest of the journal's leadership, including Howard Simons, who had been contacted by Califano on the morning after the break-in, the 2 journalists began to pool their resources and contacts. At least, this is the official story. The networks of sources that Woodward and Bernstein cultivated suggest that other dynamics were in play. There was, for example, Robert Bennett, the owner of the public relations firm Robert R. Mullen and Company. Bennett said that he had been feeding stories to Bob Woodward of the Washington Post with the understanding that there would be no attribution to Bennett. Right. Mullen and Company was also the firm that E. Howard Hunt had gone to work for at the suggestion of CIA Director Richard Helms, following Hunt's questionable retirement from the CIA. In addition, the firm itself was closely aligned with the CIA. An undated agency summary, drafted sometime during the Watergate affair, noted that Robert R. Mullen and Company has been utilized by the CIA's Central Cover Staff since 1963. Mr. Mullen has provided sensitive cover support overseas for agency employees, and he was instrumental in the formation of the Cuban Freedom Committee. Wow. The Cuban Freedom Committee was similar to CIA projects like Radio Free Europe and broadcast anti-Castro propaganda to Cuba. In addition, Robert R. Mullen and Company's attorney was Edward Bennett Williams, a partner in the same law firm as Joseph Califano. As an aside, among Williams' clients was Robert Vesco, whose frighteningly intricate history and peripheral role in Watergate are discussed in the next chapter. And what about Woodward himself? Carefully removed from the official Watergate narrative is Woodward's stint, immediately prior to his career as a journalist in the military. After attending Yale, Woodward had gone into the Navy, where he spent 4 years of sea duty as a communications officer. He served under 2 superiors who would go on to land important positions at the Pentagon. The first of these was Rear Admiral Francis Fitzpatrick, who became the Assistant Chief of Naval Operations for Communications and Cryptology. The second was Admiral Welander, the top assistant to Maurer and also associate of Haig, who, as discussed, was a central player in the Radford-Maurer espionage ring. In August 1969, Woodward, still an enterprising young naval officer, arrived in Washington, D.C. Because of his expertise in communication systems, the military gave him a post at the Pentagon, where he worked in direct proximity to Fitzpatrick and Welander. As Len Kolodny writes, Woodward was tasked with overseeing approximately 30 sailors who manned the terminals, teletypes, and classified coding machines at the Naval Communications Center through which all Navy traffic flowed, from routine orders to top-secret messages. It was a sensitive position that afforded Woodward access to more than 100 communication channels, among them, according to Admiral Fitzpatrick, the top secret SR-1 channel, through which the Navy sent and received its most important messages. We have already encountered SR-1 under its colloquial name of the Weather Channel, the secret communication system utilized by Task Force 157. Woodward, in other words, was directly linked to the cable traffic of this ultra-secret unit, which became connected in one direction to Edward Wilson, Robert Keith Gray, and the China Lobby Complex, and in the other direction to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Nixon administration's internal power struggles over East Asian policy and overarching bureaucratic organization. Furthermore, in this position, Woodward would have answered directly to Admiral Thomas Maurer, who not only made SR-1 available to Kissinger, but who had also sought to undermine Kissinger's efforts in the China Initiative. According to Kolodny's sources, which included Admiral Maurer himself, Woodward also acted as a briefer, meaning he collected information from a variety of sources for assimilation and subsequent presentation to his commanding officers. Maurer was not the only military official who would have received Woodward's briefings. On his briefing assignment, writes Kolodny, Woodward was often sent across the river from the Pentagon to the basement of the White House, where he would enter the offices of the National Security Council. There, Woodward would act as briefer to Alexander Haig. This suppressed connection between Woodward and Haig led Kolodny to suggest that Haig was, in fact, the infamous Deep Throat, the mysterious informant who provided Woodward and Bernstein with vital bits and pieces of information. The more recent claims made by Mark Felt, a veteran FBI official, to have been the real Deep Throat had disturbed the Haig thesis. Felt was certainly in position to have known a lot. His posts at the FBI had included, for example, overseeing the COINTELPRO operations before he became assistant director of the Bureau in 1972. He also had a personal animus against the administration, which had passed over him and appointed a new director at J. Edgar Hoover's death. But as Kolodny's co-author Robert Getlin has pointed out, certain essential pieces of information that Woodward attributes to Deep Throat simply could not have been known by Felt at that time and place. As a result, it has been posited that Deep Throat was likely a composite of multiple informants. Next section of this part, an interestingly titled section of this part, Calls, Girls, and Mobsters. The Watergate The Watergate scandal was one of the great political imbroglios of the latter half of the 20th century. It collapsed an entire administration, set off a decade of power plays, reform efforts, and bureaucratic changes. It contributed, along with the deeply unpopular Vietnam War and subsequent revelations of government skullduggery, to an overwhelming air of distrust on the part of the American people toward their rulers. You don't say. Yet, what remains remarkable, despite all of this, is that the rationale for the break-ins has never been satisfactorily explained. There is an array of competing explanations and interpretations, even from the burglars themselves. According to James McCord, the reason they broke in was to place listening devices in Larry O'Brien's offices. E. Howard Hunt, meanwhile, suggested that the team had been dispatched to the Watergate to unearth evidence of illicit campaign contributions being made to the DNC by Fidel Castro. However, as Jim Hogan has untiringly pointed out time and again, there is no evidence to substantiate either claim. The FBI never found evidence of the purported bugs, which would not have worked anyway. As Hogan writes, O'Brien's office was part of the interior suite at the DNC and was shielded from McCord's listening post in the motel across the street from the Watergate. As for the Castro claims, evidence has never surfaced that the leader of Cuba was funneling money to the Democratic politicians, and it is highly unlikely that this is what McCord, Hunt, and the company were rummaging for. The most likely repositories for information of this sort, the offices of the DNC treasurer, for example, were left untouched over the course of the break-ins. There is also the issue of unexplained evidence, the most important of which may be the mysterious key in the possession of Eugenio Martinez. At the time of the burglar's arrest, the lock that matched the key was not discovered. Yet, in the subsequent investigation, it was found that the key fit the lock of the office of Maxine Wells, the secretary to R. Spencer Oliver, whose phone had been tapped. Hogan states that, according to arresting officer Carl Schaffler, photographic equipment was clamped to the top of Wells' desk. Len Kalani asks, why would a Watergate burglar have a key to Wells' desk in his possession? And what items of interest to a Watergate burglar were maintained in Wells' locked desk drawer? Good question. Intimations that something strange had been afoot involving Oliver's secretaries was reported early on in Nightmare by veteran journalist Anthony Lucas. Alfred Baldwin, a former FBI agent hired by McCord to monitor calls being made from Oliver's phone at the nearby listening post, stated that the secretaries were actively using the phone when Oliver, who was frequently away from the office for long stretches of time, was not present. Some of these conversations, Lucas writes, citing Baldwin, were explicitly intimate. Lucas adds that so spicy were some of the conversations that they have given rise to confirmed reports that the telephone was being used for some sort of call girl service, catering to congressmen and other prominent Washingtonians. Here, Lucas is being deceptive, as the allegations concerning the potential of a Watergate-connected call girl service do not arise on the basis of the phone calls alone. There was, in fact, evidence that several rings were being operated at the nearby Columbia Plaza apartments, adjacent to both the Watergate and to the motel where McCord's listening post was located. These rings were overseen by at least two madams, Little Lori and Helen Henderson. Another woman involved was identified by Hogan as Tess. He writes, besides their location at the Columbia Plaza apartments, the prostitutes had at least two things in common. The first was the homogeneity of their clients. With few exceptions, they were professional men, lobbyists, lawyers, stockbrokers, physicians, congressional aides, and real estate developers. They were among the movers and shakers of the Capitol and included at least one U.S. senator, an astronaut, a Saudi prince, a clutch of U.S. and KCIA intelligence agents, and a host of prominent Democrats, according to a 1971 police intelligence report. The Watergate Hotel was a prime source of their business. To make matters more complicated, Lou Russell, linked to McCord and other figures nebulously circling around the Watergate affair, was closely acquainted to the proprietors of the call girl ring. Writes Hogan, according to Russell's friends, Russell chose to idle away his leisure time in the apartments at the Columbia Plaza. He was a friend to many of the girls, a sometime customer, a freelance bouncer, and a source of referrals. Russell may, however, have been playing an even more important role at those apartments. Philip Bailey, a figure of incredible importance to the deeper context of the Watergate saga, encountered Russell there with a setup that included recording equipment, cameras, and two-way mirrors to record the girls' clients. Who was Philip Bailey, and why was he important to these unfolding events? Bailey was a D.C. lawyer with a predilection for the dark side of life. He presented himself as a well-connected player, an operative in the Capitol's nighttime world. However, the reality was a bit different. He was, to quote Phil Stanford, a fledgling lawyer at the bottom of the D.C. legal food chain. A graduate of the local Catholic University of America Law School, his self-declared role model was Bobby Baker, the notoriously crooked political fixer of the Democratic establishment of the 1950s and 1960s. Baker himself operated within a constellation of Texas-based businessmen and organized crime figures. It is possible that, after setting his sights on that type of milieu, Bailey decided to begin his ascent into these networks. His preferred clientele included petty criminals, drug dealers, and prostitutes. In Secret Agenda, Bailey is described as being close to the call girl Jim Hogan dubbed Tess, which was not her real name. Len Kalani in Silent Coup identifies Bailey's consort in the call girl ring as Kathy Dieter. To make matters more confusing, Dieter was not the girl's real name either. She was actually Erica Haiti Rican, a woman who between 1965 and 1966 had performed as a stripper at Washington's Blue Mirror Club in the notorious 14th Street district. Rican, like Bailey, was well connected. Her best friend was Maureen Biner, who at the time was dating John Dean, the Nixon administration's White House counsel. Dean and Biner later married, and she changed her name to Maureen Dean. Why does that name sound familiar? John Dean. Recon and Biner had known each other for many years at this point for a brief period in the late 1960s. Biner was married to George Owen, scout for the Dallas Cowboys. Owen had the inside track to the top Texas power players. His personal friends included the oil heir Clint Murchison Jr., Bedford Wynn, the offspring of a prominent Dallas family with numerous interests, including oil, real estate, industry, insurance, and law. Bobby Baker, and Gordon McClendon, a prominent radio man and occasional intelligence asset. McClendon's close associates included, interestingly enough, Jack Ruby, the famous mobster for killing Lee Harvey Oswald, and David Atlee Phelps, the CIA officer connected to both E. Howard Hunt and James McCord. Maureen writes in her autobiography of an extended trip to Lake Tahoe with a good friend and new friend I had met through George, Haiti Recon. What's interesting here is that through their mutual relationship with George Owen and the High Flyers of Dallas, Texas, Maureen and Recon were moving into a circle that overlapped considerably with organized crime interests. McClendon's friend Jack Ruby was himself an insider and participant in the Dallas criminal underworld. The Murchison oil and construction interest, meanwhile, deployed as lobbyist Irvin Davison, who was the lobbyist for the CIA, the FBI, Israel, and crime bosses such as Carlos Marcello. Oh my God. The Murchisons also maintained their own ties to Marcello. Recon continued to maintain her ties to this side of Texas, even after moving to D.C. Phil Stanford reports that within her contact book were Wynn, McClendon, Murchison, and others. The roster of names helps to further illustrate the convergence of Texas business interests and organized crime. One of the names, for example, was Fred Black Jr. Black was a close friend and business partner of the controversial Bobby Baker, and also an intimate of Mo Dallett's, Johnny Rosselli, and Clifford Jones, the mob-linked lieutenant governor of Nevada. Oh my God. Jones was also an alleged confidant of Meyer Lansky. He is everywhere, representing his interests in several Vegas casinos. It might be important then that Black, who maintained an apartment in the Watergate, also owned stakes in several Caribbean-owned casinos owned by Jones. Another name that appeared in Recon's contact book was Ben Barnes, a Texas real estate major who had served as the state's lieutenant governor between 1968 and 1973. Among Barnes's close circle of contacts was Herman Beebe, and the two, by the 1980s, were linked to a string of collapsed savings and loans, many of which bore the fingerprints of organized crime and intelligence agencies in their demise. Yet, even in the 1960s and 1970s, Beebe was making the rounds. The network of banks and real estate ventures that would lay the groundwork for his later escapades were tightly interwoven with the criminal enterprises of Carlos Marcello. Just as Rican maintained her Texas connections after moving to Washington, she also continued her own personal ties to powerful organized crime figures. At the time, she was involved with Phil Bailey and active in the ring operating across from the Watergate. She was also reportedly the girlfriend of the mob boss of Washington, D.C., Joe Neslin. Mob bosses are everywhere and intertwined with government. The government itself, at this point, is organized crime. Born in Washington, D.C., in September 1913, Neslin was first arrested in 1931 for violation of illegal whiskey laws. Over the years, he raked up an immense number of encounters with the law, primarily arrests for his persistent involvement in illicit gambling activities. Neslin's early gambling operations were operated from numerous establishments such as the Spartan Club. Many of his ventures were carried out in partnership with Charlie the Blade Tourné. The pair were arrested in June 13, 1963, in a gambling parlor the two had organized in Maryland. One 1962 FBI report identified Tourné as the collection man for Neslin. Neslin and Tourné's gambling interests intertwined with those of Dino Cellini, Meyer Lansky's top casino operator in the Caribbean. Neslin, for example, maintained a stake in the Colony Club in London, which was operated for a time by Dino Cellini. Much earlier, in pre-revolutionary Cuba, Neslin had worked at the Tropicana Club in Havana, where Cellini was acting as manager. At this time, Tourné was managing the nearby Capri. In the wake of Castro's 1959 revolution, Cellini, Tourné, Meyer Lansky's brother Jake, and Florida mob boss Santo Traficante were imprisoned together in a camp called the Trescorina. In addition, in the early 1960s, Neslin and Tourné co-owned a posh Miami Beach house. My God. In 1964, this property was inhabited by Alvin Malnick, a mafia financier who was something of a protege of Lansky's. Malnick, in this same period, was plugged into the web of international banking that the organized crime groups surrounding Lansky used to move the money that reaped from countless real estate interests, their narcotics trade, and the skim from casinos. He was also the counsel for the Allied Empire Corporation, a major stockholder in Lansky's offshore Bank of World Commerce. Given these sorts of associations, it is perhaps noteworthy that George Owen told Len Kolodny that he first met Rican in the mid-1960s in Antigua. He was visiting the land with his good friends Bedford Wynn and Gilbert Lee Beckley. Beckley, a world-renowned gambler and bookie described by Time as a valuable man to the Cosa Nostra, co-owned a hotel on the island called the Miramar, which is where Owen first crossed paths with Rican. An FBI report states that in 1966, Charles Tourné was dispatched to Antigua to protect Beckley's interests. The same report states that in addition to Beckley, co-investors in the Miramar included Anthony Fat Tony Salerno of the Genovese crime family. Nesline's DC operations seem to have been enabled by the extensive corruption of the local police force. Shocker. An FBI report from late May 1962 describes information provided by an informant with intimate knowledge of police involvement with organized crime in the area. The informant's name is withheld in the report. He felt that his life and that of his family would be placed in jeopardy if knowledge of his interviews and cooperation with the FBI were even suspected by the various members of the Washington, D.C. area gambling element. The report continues. No gambler operates in the Washington, D.C. area unless he obtains protection from the Metropolitan Police Department. According to the anonymous informant, influence over the gambling rackets was divided up according to the various police precincts, with the gambling backers often having to deal directly with the captain of the particular precinct. But perhaps some of the most interesting information concerns Roy Blick, the Morals Squad head who worked so closely with the CIA. Redacted. Stated that he was told by Mitchell and feels certain that it is true that Snags Lewis was paying Inspector Roy Blick and Chief of the Police Barnett. He had been recently advised that Snags Lewis, Billy Mitchell, and Joe Nesline are currently doing business with Blick. Wow. The next section of this chapter, potential motives. I wonder what the potential motives are. Let's find out. Sometime in 1971, Haiti Ricon came to Philip Bailey with the idea of using his contacts at the DNC to expand the customer base for the girls at Columbia Plaza. The connection between Bailey and the DNC was Spencer Oliver, and the thought was someone, perhaps Oliver himself, perhaps another employee, would be able to steer high-rolling poles to Ricon's Columbia Plaza operation. According to Bailey, he managed to make contact with someone within the DNC, and the arrangements were made for a call-out line to be set up from the offices. The location of this line was purported to be the phone of Spencer Oliver, though he does not appear to have been the one with whom Bailey was negotiating. As 1971 gave way to 1972, the operation was bearing fruit, reportedly with one client or more a day being set up through the DNC offices. Other clients, writes Lencolani, drawing on statements made by Bailey, included men from the State Department, major hotels in town, a private club, and the Library of Congress. Unfortunately for Bailey, trouble was looming on the horizon. On April 6, 1972, the DC police and the FBI raided his home. While Bailey was away, tied up in court, the authorities were busy pulling a veritable treasure trove of incredibly incriminating items from his apartment. Among the sex paraphernalia, video recording equipment, and other such odds and ends were photographs, home movies, ledgers, and contact books. Each of these was taken into custody and logged as evidence. The reason for the raid, interestingly enough, was separate from the complex arrangements running at Watergate and the Columbia Plaza apartments. Bailey was being charged with violating the Mann Act, which is better known as the White Slave Traffic Act of 1910. The crooked lawyer, it seems, was accused of drugging a university student, taking pornographic pictures of her and blackmailing her. As the story goes, Bailey threatened to dispatch copies of the photographs to her school's administrators and her parents if she did not submit to the attentions of his political cronies and business associates. So she did submit, having sex with 15 consecutive partners at a party hosted by Bailey in a suburban Maryland house. Phil Stanford, in his book on Recon, presents a slightly more complicated story. He identifies the student as Astrid LeFlang, who Bailey had attempted to recruit into Recon's call girl ring. Recon, however, rejected LeFlang on the grounds that she was too low class and not sophisticated enough for the operations she was trying to get up and running. Soon enough, LeFlang was feeling snubbed and began to provide information to the Capitol Police Vice Squad. Thus began Bailey's legal woes. That's what you get. Within a month, Assistant U.S. Attorney John Rudy was building a major case against Bailey. By this time, many women had come forward with accusations against the attorney, and lists of potential witnesses were being compiled. Because Bailey's social networks were so broad, there were quite a few to choose from. Nevertheless, the media buzz about Bailey's situation and the seriousness of his crimes was minimal, at least until June 9th, when the Washington Star ran a front page story stamped with the headline, Capitol Hill Call Girl Ring Uncovered. The FBI has uncovered, the article states, a high-priced call girl ring allegedly headed by a Washington attorney and staffed by secretaries and office workers from Capitol Hill and involving at least one White House secretary. The article seems to be alluding directly to the Recon call girl ring, while misconstruing just how involved Bailey was with it. Who exactly tipped off the star is unknown, but it set off alarms elsewhere in D.C. Attorney John Rudy received a call from John Dean demanding access to all documentary evidence involved in the Bailey investigation. Rudy and his assistants were personally summoned to the White House. The evidence, including Bailey's contact book, was packed up and brought to Dean. Rudy would later tell Kolodny that the main focus of Dean's attention, besides the potential sources for the Star's story, was the Black Contact book. Many of the individuals in the book were hidden behind aliases, and two of those were Kathy Dieter and Clout. Interesting name. Rudy had taken pains to confirm the identities behind the aliases. Kathy Dieter was Heidi Recon, while Clout was her good friend and former roommate, Maureen Biner. Rudy, at the time, did not know that Dean was dating Biner, or, for that matter, that Biner had moved in with Dean. The time frame of these events is telling. The raid on Bailey took place on April 6, 1972, and a day later, the CRP provided G. Gordon Liddy with $83,000. On April 12th, McCord received a large chunk of this money to purchase electronic surveillance equipment. Hogan notes that it was 3 days later, on April 15th, that William Haddad wrote to Jack Anderson for the first time, informing him of plans to spy on Democrats. The first of the break-ins at the DNC then took place towards the end of May. The Star article in John Dean's encounter with Bailey contact book was June 9th. On June 12th, Jeb Magruder suggested to Liddy another break-in, ostensibly for the purposes of acquiring the files of DNC Chairman Larry O'Brien. Magruder, however, had not concocted the scheme out of whole cloth. It had been Dean's idea. Within 5 days, the police were in the DNC file, officers making arrests, and Eugenio Martinez was trying to prevent the mysterious key from falling into police hands. From there, it was all downhill for the Nixon administration. Had Dean ultimately ordered the break-ins to obtain potentially incriminating information related to the Watergate Columbia Plaza ring, which was connected to his wife via Heidi, Rickon? With the specter of organized crime, chiefly Rickon's relationship with Joe Neslin, in play, and the rumors swirling about high-profile Washingtonians indulging in prostitution, it was certainly an explosive situation. Perhaps Dean was hoping to get out ahead of any revelations that might emerge from the investigation of Bailey and his impending conviction. John Dean. Why does that name sound familiar? There are also other looming questions. Was there a connection between the Watergate call girl ring and the sorts of sexual blackmail operations alleged to have been carried out by Edwin Wilson? Jim Hogan offers some provocative evidence. For instance, the trick book maintained by little Lori, Barbara Rabate, reportedly contained the names Ed Wilson and Tungsten Park. The Tungsten Park was clearly Tungsten Park. Furthermore, he writes that the apartment owned by Tess, Heidi Rickon, had been rented in the name of Philip Bailey, but had actually been paid for by a wealthy defense contractor, a sometime lobbyist on Capitol Hill who owned a huge farm and claimed to hail from Houston, Texas. Each of these descriptions match Edwin Wilson, who had indeed spent time as a lobbyist, covertly working on behalf of the CIA, owned the sprawling farm in Virginia, and managed lucrative defense contracts via the TF-157 front companies, one of which, Around World Shipping and Chartering, operated from Houston, Texas. The implications of this are immense. If Wilson and Park are indeed connected to the Watergate ring, then it was plugged into a network that encompassed the activities of Robert Keith Gray, the Georgetown Club, the internal politics of Task Force 157, and ultimately, the forces seemingly aligning themselves against Richard Nixon. Seen from this point of view, the Watergate incident, which imploded Nixon's presidency, appears less like a sloppy robbery gone awry and more like an elaborate frame-up, followed by a controlled demolition. The specter of the CIA in Watergate continued even into the trials that followed the unveiling of the break-ins, as evidenced by the man who was appointed as the Watergate special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, a partner at the Houston-based law firm in Fulbright and Jaworski. Jaworski populated numerous boards and maintained affiliations with a wide gamut of powerful interests. He held the position of trustee at the MD Anderson Foundation, which had been established in the late 1930s to help build the now famous medical center in Houston. Sometime towards the end of the 1950s, MD Anderson became a conduit for funds originating from the CIA. As trustee, Jaworski was aware of the nature of the funds and had signed off on it, as had the foundation's president, John Friedman, who was a former partner at Jaworski's. Another Houston-based foundation moving CIA money in this same period was the San Jacinto Fund. Heading the San Jacinto Fund was Ernest Cockrell Jr., a board member of the wealthy Bank of the Southwest. Jaworski and his law partners could also be found here. A 1977 Texas Monthly article describes how the partners had their closest and most lucrative relationship with the Bank of the Southwest. In addition to serving as the bank's legal counsel, members of the firm dominated the board of directors and occupied the top executive positions. Another bank director was the businessman John Domeno, then the representative of Schlumberger Oil Interests in America. Schlumberger would later be implicated in the covert support for the anti-Castro Cuban exiles, suggesting yet another CIA element in this network of individuals. By the time that the Watergate scandal had erupted, Jaworski could be found working closely with a veteran of those same anti-Castro operations, and one who played a prominent role in the events detailed in this chapter, Alexander Haig. The nature of this relationship was so particular that it saw Haig act as a channel for the flow of information to Jaworski, including some which had not been subpoenaed. It seems that Haig was playing a direct, if shadowy, role in shaping the overall thrust of the Watergate prosecution. You don't say. And there ends that portion of Call Girls. Now we get to the Page Boy scandal. The sordid story rumbling beneath the Watergate fiasco was not the only time that Robert Keith Gray's name would come up in connection with sexual blackmail rings. As previously mentioned, John DeCamp's 1992 classic book on the Franklin scandal raised the specter of Gray and his connections to Edwin Wilson due to his close association with Harold Anderson, the publisher of the Omaha World Herald newspaper and the close ally of the man at the city of that particular web, Larry King. Anderson himself stood accused of being a willing participant in King's activities. Nearly a decade earlier, Gray has surfaced in the course of an investigation into a purported sex and drug ring that allegedly operated on Capitol Hill. The scandal made a momentary splash in the media, but it is now merely a footnote. It began when Leroy Williams Jr., a congressional page, pages where high school students employed to fulfill various administrative tasks, such as acting as couriers for congressmen, made startling accusations that he had sex with three House members and procured homosexual prostitutes for a senator. Let me take a pause here. They want to go on a crusade against gay people and probably in politics, the whole LGBTQ diaspora. But yet, you don't even want to investigate your own when they're doing things in your favor. Whew. Think about the hypocrisy. You're going to go against a crusade, the whole lavender scare. Meanwhile, they're already in your ranks And it's funny, it's those people that are in your ranks that are doing this whole crusade. And then we wonder why we have all these scandals. They're doing a crusade while engaging in fucked up activities. Epstein scandal. I'm going to call it Epstein Gate because that's what this is. Facts. They'll talk about everything else, culture, war, this. But you're doing this shit behind closed doors. Well, I can't say closed doors. You're covering it up, knowing it's going on. I had to take a stop right there. But I'm going to continue on. Let me repeat that last part. It began, it really is. It began when Leroy Williams Jr., a congressional page. Pages were high school students employed to fulfill various administrative tasks, such as acting as couriers for congressmen, made startling accusations that he had sex with 3 White House members and procured homosexual prostitutes for a senator. The latter incident was reported as having taken place at the Watergate office complex. Initial reports suggested that unnamed witnesses came forward with further information on sexual activities between politicians and pages, prostitution rings, and a connected drug ring operating on the Hill. CBS Evening News ran the story first on July 30th, 1982, and the hints of drug abuse were quickly linked to arrests that had occurred several months earlier. On April 19th, Douglas Marshall, Robert Finkel, and Troy Todd had been nabbed by undercover Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police for possession of cocaine. Of the 3, Marshall and Finkel were charged with distributing and conspiring to distribute cocaine. Todd and another accomplice, a young woman named Devin DePries, were subsequently named as unindicted co-conspirators. Facts. That's what it is. You have to look at the politicians. Newspapers described DePries as Georgetown cocktail waitress, though she appears to have been an assistant to Michael O'Hara, the owner of a D.C. discotheque called Tramps. Others stated that she reportedly socialized with a California congressman now under investigation by drug agents, and was subsequently entered into the Justice Department Federal Witness Program. For real, hence the title of the book, One Nation Under Blackmail. And moved to an undisclosed location. This odd cast of characters operated a cocaine ring that employed the services of congressional pages, tour guides, and other Hill employees who enjoyed wide-ranging access to members of Congress. Douglas Marshall himself had been a page, while Robert Finkel had worked as an elevator operator in the Capitol. On July 7th, Jack Anderson reported that more than 15 members of Congress were customers of a cocaine ring that operated on Capitol Hill, the ringleaders have told narcotics agents. He also appeared on ABC News Nightline with Sam Donaldson, publicly linking the cocaine ring with the emerging allegations of prostitution and sexual abuse. Donaldson, All right, Jack, tell us about the page setup. Did you actually catch some pages involved as couriers? Mr. Anderson. There were some pages involved, but the drug scam changed into a sex scam later. I know very little about the sex angle of it, except that the same people were involved. Some of the same people. Donaldson. But pages were acting as couriers for the dealing of drugs? Mr. Anderson. That's correct. So were congressional aides. By the time that Anderson was making these accusations, an FBI investigation and a House Ethics Committee inquiry had formed to assess the possibilities of a sex and drugs ring on Capitol Hill. Oddly enough, old Watergate familiar Joseph Califano was put in charge of the inquiry. Califano's team employed a score of lawyers and investigators, including 2 private investigators, Richard Powers, a former New York City police officer, and John Jack Moriarty, a former D.C. police officer. Gray's name came up in the inquiry from an anonymous tip, which was handled by Powers, who drafted a memo on it to Califano. The memo quickly disappeared. The lead to Gray arose on July 21st, when Ethics Committee counsel Donald Purdy and John Moriarty interviewed yet another figure from the Watergate days, D.C. police officer Carl Schaeffler. Schaeffler turned over the extensive information that he had compiled on Gray, his links to Edwin Wilson and the CIA, rumors of his involvement in the use of distribution of narcotics, wild tales of orgies taking place at his home in Rehoboth Beach. The most alarming allegation made by Schaeffler, however, was that a consultant for Diamond Shamrock, a major Texas-based oil and gas concern, and a local photographer personally known to Gray were involved in a male prostitution service on Capitol Hill. Diamond Shamrock was, at the time, a client of Gray and Company, an independent PR firm set up by Gray in the early 1980s. Several weeks after he provided this information to Purdy and Moriarty, Schaeffler was contacted by a security specialist with longtime intelligence ties, Michael Pilgrim. Pilgrim wanted to know if Schaeffler had been hired by H&K. Gray had left the firm to start Gray & Company to keep tabs on their former executive. Pilgrim, in return, had been asked to assess Schaeffler by Neil Livingstone, yet another strange character from the murky netherworld where intelligence and Beltway subterfuge intersected. Livingstone, who will be discussed at greater length in the next chapter, was at the time working for Gray & Gray at Company, while also maintaining extensive ties to the circles around Ted Shackley, Thomas Clines, and Edwin Wilson that went back to the mid-1970s. The arrival of Livingstone on the scene raised even more puzzling questions. As Susan Trento asked, how did Livingstone find out that Schaeffler had received allegations about Gray? The day after his encounter with Pilgrim, Schaeffler was contacted by Thomas Fortune, Gray's attorney. It was an interesting choice for a lawyer as, in 1981, Fortune had taken over from Roy Cohn as the chief attorney for Tony Salerno, the boss of the Genovese crime family. These ties may have run deep. Gray was reportedly a friend of Cohn, though, as previously mentioned, the exact nature of their relationship remains vague. A year after the Pageboy scandal first broke, Salerno arranged for the appointment of Jackie Presser as president of the Teamsters Union. Presser was a client and close associate of Gray The two may have even owned a mysterious company together called Member Services Corporation. 420 offered Schaeffler the opportunity to interview Gray, with the clarification that Gray would deny the allegations that Schaeffler had made to Purdy and Moriarty. He then added that it was Moriarty himself who had turned over the information to Gray's associates. It was an incredible conflict of interest. In addition to working on the Ethics Committee probe, both Moriarty and Powers were moonlighting on behalf of Gray and Company. Powers himself was a longtime associate of 420, who had employed Powers as his own private investigator. In a subsequent meeting with Powers, Schaeffler himself was offered a job working for Gray at a very lucrative salary. Schaeffler saw this as an attempted bribe and reported it to the U.S. Attorney. Very soon, a sweeping Department of Justice investigation was underway. On September 28, 1982, the New York Times ran an article stamped with the title, Califano suspends two investigators in Congress sex and drugs inquiry. These two investigators were identified as Powers and Moriarty. Califano did not return repeated calls to his office, and Justice Department officials declined to disclose the nature of the charges against Mr. Moriarty and Mr. Powers. After the Moriarty and Powers debacle, the entire episode came to a close, much more quietly than it had begun. More questions than satisfactory answers were raised. In the final Ethics Committee's report, Califano cited evidence that the U.S. Capitol Police had systematically destroyed documentary records related to drug trafficking on the Hill, including vital documents put together in the critical month of July 1982, when the accusations first began to gain momentum. While the report suggested that disciplinary action in connection with the destruction might be warranted, there was insufficient evidence to conclude that the records contained information important to the committee's investigation of illicit drug use or distribution of drugs. The allegations of sexual abuse of pages and homosexual prostitution were soon swept to the side. Shocker. Leroy Williams, the page who first came forward, suddenly recanted. He told investigators working on behalf of the Ethics Committee that he concocted the tale of sexual misconduct and drug use to draw public attention to the pressures of the page system. Importantly, the congressman with whom he had claimed to have had sex, Larry Craig of Idaho, was himself a member of the House Ethics Committee. In 2007, Craig was arrested after propositioning an undercover police officer for sex in the men's restroom of the Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport. And that, ladies, gentlemen, however you identify they, them, is the end of the chapter of One Nation Under Blackmail. Chapter 5, Shades of Gray. Yeah, got your ass. Got him. And that was quite a lengthy chapter. And this, this upcoming chapter, I'm probably going to divide into like 3 to 4 parts. Is because it's a lot. It's just a lot. This next chapter, chapter 6, is a private CIA, which is 101 pages. And I can assure you, it ain't a light 101 pages. And if you do get this book, I assure you this information ain't coming out of nowhere. At the end of each chapter, they have links to where they got the information from, who they got it from, the books, sources, everything, interviews, everything, even documents that they're actually linked to documents at the end of this book to show you where this information came from that are legit. I'm going to read some of these documents when I get to the end of this book. But with that, that is the end of chapter 5, Shades of Gray, which there were plenty of shades of gray. There are still plenty of shades of gray. With that, thank you. Thank you for being around, and hope you have a enjoy the rest of your day and enjoy your summer and stay informed. Thank you, and have the rest of your day. Paul Greene-Dennis out.